All four of Moscow's major airports shut down simultaneously, not one. All four, Sheremetyevo, Domodedovo, Vnukovo, and Ramenskoye, grounded on the night of June 22, 2026, as Ukrainian drones attacking from multiple directions overwhelmed the air defense architecture that Russia's military establishment had assured the Kremlin was impenetrable. The capital of a nuclear-armed state, home to 11 million people and the seat of the government conducting one of the largest land wars in modern European history, brought to a grinding halt by a swarm of drones from a nation Russia has spent 4 years trying to subjugate. Let that sink in for a moment. Moscow's airport closure was not the consequence of a single successful drone getting through. It was the consequence of a drone campaign so expansive, so multi-directional, and so difficult to neutralize with conventional air defense engagement that civilian aviation authorities had no choice but to suspend all arrivals and departures because the engagement envelopes of the defense systems and the flight corridors of commercial aircraft had become, in operational terms, the same space. This is not a story about airport disruption. It is a story about the systematic architectural failure of Russia's concentric air defense rings around its own capital, a failure years in the making, now impossible to hide. Understand the assumption Russia embedded in its Moscow air defense architecture. In doctrinal terms, Moscow was supposed to be the most protected airspace on the planet outside of strategic nuclear command facilities. Russia ringed its capital with three nested defensive layers. The outermost layer was designed to engage threats at extended range, detecting, tracking, and neutralizing incoming strike platforms before they approached within operational relevance of the capital. The middle layer provided redundancy for anything that penetrated the outer ring, employing a mixture of long-range surface-to-air missile systems, radar networks, and interceptor aircraft to engage threats at medium range. The inner layer was the final defense ring immediately surrounding Moscow, the densest concentration of point defense systems, electronic warfare capability, and short-range interceptors in Russia's entire inventory. This architecture was built to defeat Cold War scenarios and was updated through the 2010s and 2020s with successive layers of modern hardware. The S-400 and S-300 families were the backbone of the outer and middle rings. Panzer S-1 systems supplemented the inner ring. Radar coverage was theoretically continuous. On paper, this architecture was imposing. On the actual battlefield of the 2025 and 2026 drone campaigns, it has proven to be a system designed for a threat environment that no longer exists and catastrophically unequipped for the threat environment that does. Here is the hidden military variable. Russia's Moscow air defense architecture was designed around the assumption that the primary threats requiring defeat would be large, relatively slow, conventionally distinct platforms, cruise missiles with radar cross-sections, ballistic re-entry vehicles with predictable trajectories, and manned aircraft operating in identifiable corridors. The S-400 and S-300 systems are optimized for exactly these threat signatures. What they are structurally poorly suited for, and what every operational assessment since 2022 has increasingly confirmed, is the simultaneous engagement of large numbers of low-cost, low-altitude, low-radar cross-section one-way attack drones operating in distributed swarm geometries designed specifically to saturate the fire control capacity of any fixed defensive architecture. Pull the lens back and examine what Ukraine has done to Moscow's air defenses as a campaign, not just as an event. In July 2025, Ukraine launched approximately 3,000 drones against Russian military targets in a single month. By March 2026, that figure had escalated to 7,000 in a month, according to verified reporting from United 24 Media. The scale of escalation is not incidental. It is the strategy. It is the deliberate application of what military theorists call a saturation methodology, not the attempt to find the perfect trajectory through a defensive gap, but the systematic erosion of the defensive system's ability to engage all incoming threats simultaneously by generating more threat vectors than the defense can service in the available engagement window. And it gets even more serious from here. In June 2026, Ukraine launched more than 400 drones in a single overnight operation near Moscow, an attack that struck an oil depot and multiple logistics facilities while simultaneously forcing the shutdown of all four major airports. The Russian Defense Ministry reported intercept claims, as it always does. But the intercept claim and the shutdown are mutually contradictory as proof of success. If Moscow's air defense architecture had genuinely neutralized all inbound threats with the confidence Russia publicly claimed, civilian aviation would not need to be suspended. The suspension is itself the evidence of system-level saturation. When a defense architecture forces the closure of the country's premier commercial air hub to prevent airliners from being struck by debris from interceptions, or more honestly, because the engagement environment has become too uncertain to clear, that architecture is not succeeding, it is managing failure. What happens next changes everything when you understand the doctrinal mathematics at work. Every S-400 engagement against an incoming drone costs Russia approximately $2 to $4 million in interceptor missile expenditure. The drones being intercepted cost Ukraine between $2,000 and $8,000 each at current production costs. Ukraine is forcing Russia into an economically catastrophic exchange ratio while simultaneously scaling its own drone production capacity at a rate Russia's defense industrial base cannot match in interceptor missile replenishment. The three concentric rings around Moscow are not just failing tactically. They are failing economically in a way that makes sustained operation of the current architecture mathematically untenable at the volume of drone attacks Ukraine is now generating. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level, because the airport closures are the visible symptom of a deeper command and control pathology. Russia's national air defense is managed through a hierarchical system that, in theory, coordinates intercept assignments between the outer, middle, and inner rings to prevent fratricide, manage radar handoffs, and optimize engagement sequencing. When the threat volume exceeds the coordination capacity of that hierarchical system, when there are more inbound vectors than the command nodes can assign, track, verify, and hand off in real time, the system begins to self-degrade. Intercepts are missed not because individual weapons fail, but because the coordination architecture collapses under the cognitive and processing load of simultaneous multi-vector threats. This is precisely what Western air power theorists predicted would happen to a Soviet heritage command-centric air defense architecture when subjected to modern distributed drone attack volumes. The predictions were academic until Ukraine turned them into operational reality. The June 22nd shutdown of all four Moscow airports was not an edge case anomaly. It was the logical and predictable outcome of a defensive doctrine meeting an offensive methodology specifically designed to exploit its structural weaknesses. Mayor Sobyanin reported that at least 19 drones attacked from different directions during the operation. Not 19 missiles, not 19 aircraft. 19 drones attacking from different vectors simultaneously produced a defensive saturation event sufficient to close the capital of Russia to all commercial air traffic. The number that should alarm Russian military planners is not 19, it is the rate of escalation. In August 2024, Ukraine launched over 1,000 drones against Russian targets in a month. In July 2025, 3,000. In March 2026, 7,000. The trajectory is not linear. It is compounding, and Russia's interceptor missile inventory, its radar maintenance cycle, and its fire control system have not expanded to meet it. The broader lesson here operates at a level that transcends the Ukraine conflict. What we are witnessing is the exposure of a fundamental asymmetry that will define air defense doctrine for the next generation of military competition globally. Legacy air defense architectures built to defeat Cold War threat sets, characterized by high-value, individually trackable, radar-prominent threats, are structurally incapable of defeating modern distributed drone campaigns without radical architectural redesign. The layered ring model that Russia embedded around Moscow was designed for a world in which attacking a capital required the employment of expensive, detectable, and relatively few high-performance weapon systems. In a world where attacking a capital requires launching thousands of inexpensive, low-observable, electronically simple drones, the same layered ring model becomes not a solution, but a liability. It creates static defensive nodes that consume expensive interceptors while failing to generate the engagement density required to neutralize swarm volumes. Russia knows this. The evidence that Russia knows this is visible in every panic upgrade attempt, every emergency redeployment of Pantsir systems to forward-deployed positions, every adjustment of Moscow's air defense posture that Russian military journalists and state media have been compelled to acknowledge since 2024. None of those adjustments have produced the decisive defensive improvement that would stop the airport closures from happening. Moscow is not safe. The capital of the state conducting this war is operating under conditions of persistent defensive saturation that its own government cannot publicly acknowledge without undermining the domestic narrative it has built around military supremacy. The closures are the cracks in that narrative, visible to anyone with a flight tracker and the willingness to connect cause and effect. The question this raises, and it does not have a comfortable answer for the Kremlin, is whether Russia can redesign its Moscow air defense architecture fast enough and at sufficient scale to restore meaningful protection of its capital before Ukraine's drone production capacity and operational sophistication escalate further. Based on the trajectory of the last 3 years, the honest answer is no, and stay with us, because the next wave is already being planned.